For taking the time out of your day to show up. We really appreciate y'all being here. How many of you have never been to a workers group forum before? This is the first time. Cool. Awesome. Well, welcome. For those of you who don't know, I'm Jen, by the way. I always forget to introduce myself. I'm Jen. I'm an organizer with the New Orleans Workers Group. And for those of you who don't know who we are a multinational, multiracial, and multi-generational group of workers. We organize for the unity of the global working class and for the liberation of all workers and oppressed peoples in the world. We organize for higher wages, for jobs, for food on our tables, for lower rents, for public education, for universal health care. We organize against racism, against the oppression of women, against the oppression of LGBTQ people, against the oppression of indigenous peoples, and against imperialist war. We oppose the Pentagon, which is looting our tax dollars and using it to fund mass murders of innocent people all around the world. We oppose the monopoly media, which feeds us lie after lie after lie in order to protect the interests of the rich. And we understand that it is our labor, the labor of the working class, that produces the world's wealth, and therefore that it rightfully belongs to us. But rather than this wealth being invested back in our communities and in our livelihoods, it is stolen by the capitalist class and used to fund their private projects at our expense. And we understand that this is a fundamental contradiction in society, and that it is the underlying cause of the shared suffering of workers and oppressed peoples all around the world. And we also understand that the only way to resolve this contradiction is by completely overturning the capitalist world system, by removing the capitalist class from power, so that we can build a foundation for a better world through socialism. And only then will we be free to determine the course of our own lives. And as human beings, it is in fact our right to determine the course of our lives. And this idea of the right to self-determination is a really crucial one, and it's going to be key to understanding some of the issues that are going to be raised in these talks. So I want you all to listen for that and to think about that when you're making some connections. We had a late start, and I want to get us rolling really soon, but I do want to give some context, and I just want to say that, normally we do these forums towards the end of the month, but we called this one earlier because we feel this deep sense of urgency around some recent political developments, particularly with the recent drone attacks on the Iraqi people and the assassination of Soleimani, one of the most important and revered military leaders in the Middle East. Because of these developments, we are now on the brink of war with Iran. And this condition of the United States being either perpetually at war or on the brink of war is a defining characteristic of the times in which we live. And we live in an age not just of monopoly capitalism, but also of unfettered imperialism. And we understand that imperialism is simply the highest stage of capitalism, where the rich, through these transnational corporations, plunder the land, the labor, the wealth, and the natural resources of people that belong to the people, not just in the domestic country they're based in, but in countries all around the world. And we also understand that the United States is the most powerful, the most violent, and the most repressive imperialist country in the world today. And that the aim of US imperialism is to ensure that the rich capitalist class can continue to accumulate as much wealth as possible, and that always comes at our expense.
Yes. Woo, 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 woo.
Income disparity and wealth disparity is greater than it's ever been before. And research shows that as wealth becomes more and more concentrated, poverty actually becomes more widespread. There is a direct link between the accumulation of wealth and the spread of poverty, meaning that as the rich get richer, not only do the poor become poorer, but more and more people are slipping into poverty. Sometimes I think about this, it was kind of like mind-blowing. I was shook by this one cold, hard, brute fact, right? Because I thought, wow, based on this one fact alone, I think it might be kind of clear, or begin to be clear, why we as workers, as people who produce wealth, not as those who steal wealth,
make the distinction.
have absolutely nothing to gain from U.S. imperialism. But of course, people are hardly convinced by just one fact alone. But I'm sure that our speakers will do the rest of the work. So with that, I want to invite our first speaker, Comrade Gregory, an organizer with the New Orleans Workers Group, a dear friend of mine, and he's going to sort of lay out some of the historical conditions that gave rise to U.S. imperialism as we know it today, and also fill you guys in on the historical context surrounding political events in Iran.
Thank you, Jen. All of us here tonight, all of us are here tonight because of the recent instances of Washington's aggression against Iran, not to mention their violation of the sovereignty of Iraq by assassinating General Soleimani on their soil, and also refusing to withdraw military forces after the Iraqi parliament voted for them to leave, and after months of protest. Most of us probably have some idea that the US government and the Iranian governments have been at odds with one another since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. But if we don't step back to look at the big picture, that is, at the dynamics of the global capitalist system, then we will get lost in a great many details without gaining much clarity. I'm going to sum up the history of US intervention in Iran, but first I want to make two broad points about the nature of capitalism, which necessarily leads to imperialism, as Jen said, and about the special role of the United States in upholding the world imperialist system since World War II, the first few decades of this period after the war being an age of socialist revolution and massive anti-colonial struggles. And I will say a little bit about the resurgence of those struggles in the present period. One, we need to have as much clarity as possible concerning the nature of capitalism. As we live through crisis after crisis in which inequality is increasing, we can see that mainstream economics is wrong. Capitalism is not a system in which anyone who is smart enough or who works hard enough can accumulate wealth and which is good for the majority. Capitalism is a system based on the exploitation of the many by the few. That is clearly the case from the beginning, where we see that the early European working classes were forced to labor under extreme conditions, such as in the Industrial Revolution era factories of England. And from the very beginning, capitalism involved the military, political, and cultural subjugation of peoples, as with the colonization of the Americas, which is really a genocide, and the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade. That is to say that from the beginning, capitalism tended towards a brutal global expansion as the rising capitalist class sought labor, raw materials, and markets in ever greater quantities. In the process, another tendency emerged, and it was intrinsic to the logic of capitalism and not accidental, and that was the consolidation of small firms into large corporations and of small banks into big banks. Today we're watching as Amazon pushes other retailers out of the market, and its CEO has become the richest man in the world. Ashley will explain more about these processes in her presentation, but the point here is to say that these tendencies put major pressures on capitalist governments, which represent the capitalist class, to expand their influence globally. The competition between big players becomes more and more intense, and the capitalists and their servile governments attempt to carve up the world for themselves. Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin pointed out that by the late 19th century, most of the world had already been carved up in this way. The colonial powers of Europe, with the US as the junior partner at that time, ruled over empires in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But this situation couldn't last. Capitalism creates crises of all kinds, including war. The intense competition led to the First World War, and in the chaos of that war, the working class, along with sections of the peasantry in the Russian Empire, were able to overthrow their government and establish a worker state, and began the long process of breaking with the imperialist system. The recovery of the capitalist world system following the First World War was relatively brief. Imperialist rivalries led to a Second World War that brought about even more profound transformations on a world scale. In the process, the Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, and other peoples began rising up under the leadership of their respective communist parties and were eventually victorious, breaking with colonial domination. After the defeat of Nazism, most of the Eastern European countries joined the socialist camp, and those countries did support materially the liberation struggles in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The peoples of the global south, or Asia, Africa, and Latin America, also began asserting themselves more strongly. Wars for national independence were kicked off from Algeria to Mozambique. In the 1950s, many countries that didn't have full-scale socialist revolutions nevertheless began to break with imperialism in one way or another. Popular movements brought leaders to power who realized that they had to throw off foreign domination if they would develop their countries and bring about adequate healthcare, education, etc. to the people. Often large and very popular communist parties in these countries worked with the governments to bring about progressive policies, as in Guatemala, Indonesia, and Iran. One of the primary objectives of these national popular movements was to bring natural resources like oil and gas under the control of national governments, or even under the control of capitalists of those countries, instead of being under the control of the British or French capitalists, for instance. A pivotal moment of that period was the 1955 conference in Bandung, Indonesia, which was the first intercontinental meeting between the leaders of Africa and Asia. All of this is to say that the major trend in the world at this time was toward socialist revolution and national liberation. National liberation being what we Marxist-Leninists call the struggles for national independence against colonial or imperialist domination. On the other hand, there was a reaction to put a stop to all of this, which is exemplified by the special role of the US government. Most of the capitalist powers of Europe had suffered heavy losses in the Second World War, while the US economy, on the other hand, came out even better than before. As US investment rebuilt West Germany, France, etc., a new international capitalist order was set up with the US capitalist class and government at the top. Allied against the socialist camp, Western Europe and Japan became the US's junior partners. The capitalists and governments of these countries, generally speaking, accepted US leadership because they understood that only the US was capable militarily of economically policing the world, which is to say of stopping or attempting to stop socialist revolution and any attempts by the peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America from breaking away even moderately from imperialism. The 1950s opened with the US invading Korea, overthrowing a democratically elected government in Guatemala, etc. This was the counter trend in the world, the monster of reaction. But we should note here that struggles continued within the imperialist countries themselves. Working class and oppressed peoples won many victories, most of which have subsequently been lost in the past few decades. But all of this is the backdrop to the history of US intervention in Iran. I passed out earlier a copy of a recently declassified CIA document. The CIA has finally admitted that they were responsible, along with British intelligence, of orchestrating the coup against the democratically elected government of Iran in 1953. So this isn't just a conspiracy theory. In 1953, US and British espionage agencies orchestrated a coup in Iran, ousting the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. In 1951, under the leadership of Mossadegh, the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize Iran's oil industry, which had until then been under the control of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, later known as British Petroleum, or BP. The same company responsible for the horrible Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And again, it should be noted that the Iranian government at this time was influenced by the Tudeh Party, or the Communist Party of Iran, which was very powerful and influential in pushing for these progressive policies, and the impetus for all this was coming from the organization of the masses. The Iranian government intended to use the oil resources of the country to benefit the people of Iran rather than British and American shareholders. Before the coup, the British initiated an international boycott of Iranian oil. They were trying to put an economic stranglehold on the country to make it bend to the wishes of the British and US capitalist classes. In place of the popular government of Mossadegh, the coup orchestrators installed General Fazollah Zahedi, who shored up the rule of the Shah, who was the Iranian prince. The new regime relied heavily on Washington to stay in power. According to the CIA's own declassified documents, for example, Iranian mobsters were on the US payroll to stage pro-Shah riots as the coup was underway. Under the Shah's rule, until 1979, thousands of social leaders, trade unionists, workers, students, and peasants were tortured and murdered by the Savak Gestapo-type agency set up by the CIA, inequality soared to become almost the worst in the world, according to the International Labor Office. The people of Iran suffered all these hardships to enrich the owners of an imperialist oil cartel. This is really existing free market capitalism at work. In 1979, the Iranian masses rose up to overthrow the imperialist-backed Shah after these decades of brutal repression. And much of the movement at that time was socialist in character. The Communist Party was still quite popular in the 1970s, even though it had largely had to go underground. But there were cells that were organizing throughout the country, and there were a broad array of progressive forces. And of course, the U.S. was attempting to subvert that process, and they were backing Islamist or political Islam elements in Iran, as in other parts of the Middle East. Although many of the demands, so the revolution did happen in 1979 despite the U.S. influence. Although many of the demands of the revolution have not been met by the government of the Islamic Republic that replaced the monarchy, which is not the socialist government that many of the Iranian masses wanted, national independence remains a victory that the masses of Iranians are intent on defending. Any progressive Iranian knows that a U.S. war would be a terrible setback to their own struggle for political power within the country, as we've seen when the U.S. went in and destroyed Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. This has nothing to do with the liberation of the people. It has not brought democracy to the region. And so we can see that the provocations of the past decades, including the sanctions that Iran has been under, are all part of this long history that boils down to the U.S. trying to effectively recolonize Iran. And Iran, the government, has continued to maintain an independent stance. And we recognize their right to defend themselves against imperialist attacks, just as we recognize the right of the workers in Iran to organize on their own behalf, but we absolutely oppose any U.S. interference. And just to say something, so this isn't to not be too bleak, we can see that despite the U.S. trying to subjugate Iran and other nations to imperialist interests, this first wave of struggles after World War II did fundamentally change the terrain of struggle. U.S. imperialism and capitalism are experiencing their death throes today, which is not to say that the horrors won't go on for a very long time still, or that imperialism isn't dangerous. In fact, it may be more dangerous, or it's more erratic, at least as we see with Trump. But the peoples of the world, have experienced extreme setbacks in the past few decades, for example, with the counter-revolutions in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Yet this is it's all a bit like trying to put the toothpaste back in the bottle. Fundamental fractures keep opening up in the imperialist system, and now we are seeing increased resistance all over the world, in Haiti, Iraq, India, which just had, on January 8th, thought to be the biggest general strike in human history, Chile, etc., etc. Washington and Washington-backed regimes are increasingly unable to force their will upon the masses. And like in the 1960s, the workers in the imperialist countries themselves are rising up, as in France. So all this is to say that the possibilities of resistance continue, and we hope to build with you.